Stand up.
Well, hello there, good looking. How are you doing? How are you feeling? I hope everything is all right in your neck of the woods. And if it's not, I hope you'll reach out and connect with somebody in our amazing community on Discord or at our hangouts on Thursday night, or just email me, standupwithpete@gmail.com. I know it can get lonely out there in life. I'm very excited to have you here joining me. I've got an awesome guest, a first-timer joining me today, very smart woman. She is a sociologist at the University of Wisconsin, and she's written a new book, Holding It Together, How Women Became America's Safety Net. Jessica Calarco joins me for the first time, and she is so good. You're going to love this conversation. I've learned so much from reading the book and talking to her. It begins at 31 minutes into today's show. But first, I've got your headlines and a whole fat segment of sound clips because I gathered a whole bunch from Anthony Fauci being on Capitol Hill, questioned on Capitol Hill for you today. And now you can watch the headlines. At least this week, I'm piloting this experiment, seeing if I can make it work. If it's more or about the same amount of work, I do the headlines. Why not film them? So let's do it. These are the stories I think are important to you, your family, your country, your planet, your soul, and the rest. Let's get it started. I think the big story yesterday has to be Dr. Anthony Fauci, the former government scientist and either villain or hero, depending on who you are, celebrated or despised for his work on COVID and, of course, on AIDS and Ebola and so many other things, mostly celebrated. He was there on Capitol Hill yesterday, forcefully denying Republican allegations that he had helped fund research that sparked the pandemic or had covered up the possibility that it originated in a laboratory, calling the accusations absolutely false and simply preposterous. If you're listening on the podcast, I'll have a whole bunch of clips for you coming up. Let's move on to the big news from the White House. Yesterday, President Biden announced, and we are expected today, he will sign an executive order, very controversial, allowing him to temporarily seal the U.S. border with Mexico to migrants when crossings surge. So the move, which is all but certain to be challenged, of course, in court, would represent the single most restrictive border policy ever instituted by this president or any Democrat. The order would allow border officials to turn away migrants who claim asylum once border crossings exceed a certain threshold, restricting what has long been the surest way for migrants to stay in the United States. White House officials have discussed setting the cutoff at 2,500 illegal crossings per day. If that level is set, the border would immediately be closed because roughly 3,500 migrants are currently apprehended each day. And guess what? It's not going to go well for President Biden, and he's already being criticized by Democrats, progressives, and pro-immigration types across the country. We'll see what happens. It's supposed to get signed today, and is it going to improve his lot with Republicans or people who are really very concerned about immigration and border security? No, of course it's not. They're going to say he didn't do it, or they'll take credit for it. Yeah, you know it's true. And now to two key arguments in yesterday's news as to how you know that President Biden and Democrats are not using the Justice Department or lawfare, as they say, to attack or prosecute their political opponents. Number one, the president's son went on trial yesterday. That's right. Hunter Biden's trial on federal gun charges started yesterday. A jury had been seated on felony gun charges in Wilmington, Delaware. Hard to find a jury that doesn't know the Bidens in that tiny state, where the man who's on trial, Hunter Biden's dad's picture is in the lobby of the court. The first time in American history that the child of a sitting president is on trial, and the historic case could impact President Joe Biden's reelection campaign. Of course, First Lady Jill Biden, celebrating her 73rd birthday, was in attendance on Monday. Of course, it's not her biological son. Whether you knew that or not, I don't know. The indictment was brought by the special counsel who was appointed last year to oversee Hunter Biden probes. The president's son is accused of illegally purchasing and possessing a gun while abusing or being addicted to drugs, something I guarantee Republicans don't want a law against, by the way. Anybody can have guns, no matter how many drugs you've used or your addiction problems are, but it is a violation of federal law. Hunter Biden has pleaded not guilty to the three charges, though he's been open about his struggles with alcohol and crack cocaine addiction. And the other case that, you know, Democrats and President Biden are not using the Department of Justice to prosecute their enemies. Well, Bob Menendez, he's a Senate Democrat and has been for a long time. He's also been indicted and is on trial, and yesterday announced he's going to run for re-election, not as a Democrat, as an independent. But that's pretty audacious and arrogant. He is in his fourth week of a federal bribery trial, filed paperwork yesterday for re-election. His trial is likely, by the way, to last for another month. He has until the middle of August to withdraw from the November 5th election, but I don't know what he's going to do. I guess he's got some gold bars hidden away he can rely on, or did they take them from him? Moving on, another story. The feds did indict a far-right media executive in a massive money laundering scam. The guy's name is Bill Guan. He's the chief financial officer of the far-right Epoch Times. I don't know how it's pronounced, and I hate that outlet, of course. I think it's influenced heavily by China and funded by it, right? But a lot of people buy and believe it. Anyway, Bill Guan was indicted Monday on charges of allegedly participating in a massive money laundering scheme. The Southern District of New York released a statement saying Bill Guan, 61 of Secaucus, New Jersey, charged with one count of conspiring to commit money laundering, which carries a maximum sentence of 20 years in prison, 2 counts of bank fraud, each of which carry a maximum of 30 years in prison. And so that's what you got there. And moving on to another villain, lawyers for the families of the victims of the Sandy Hook Elementary School filed an emergency motion in U.S. bankruptcy court in Houston to liquidate Alex Jones Media Company. I'm going to be following that one very closely. Sad news out of Israel, where the IDF has confirmed that 4 hostages taken October 7th have been confirmed dead. Paramedic who was killed after he left his home to save lives, and 3 others, the families of the hostages, were informed that they are no longer alive and that Hamas has their remains, according to the Israeli Defense Forces. The deaths were announced as the Israeli ceasefire proposal backed by President Joe Biden was being challenged by right-wing ministers in Israel. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's government, who's opposed to any deal, of course, with Hamas. The IDF said its decision to pronounce the 4 hostages dead was based on intelligence. We estimate that the 4 of them were killed together in the Khan Yunis area several months ago while being held by Hamas terrorists. Some 125 Israeli hostages remain in captivity nearly 8 months after they were abducted in a deadly surprise attack by Hamas that sparked the ongoing war in Gaza. Next story, new reporting on Russia's attempt to discredit the 2024 Olympic Games, according to a new report from Microsoft's Threat Intelligence Unit. Russia is banned from the 2024 Olympics over the war in Ukraine, and this reporting says they've mounted a secret influencing campaign to seek to discredit the games and sow fears of terrorism. So that was probably expected, but now we have some reporting on it. Thought this was an interesting new state law to mention in the headlines. A new law in Vermont, the first of its kind in the United States. We love Vermont. We love Vermont. Will require fossil fuel companies to pay for a share of the costs of weather disasters fueled by climate change. The Republican governor there, Phil Scott, allowed the bill to become law last week without his signature after it passed the state legislature with support of a supermajority of Democrats, and I wanted to mention that one to you. Best wishes for a speedy recovery to Congresswoman Sheila Jackson Lee, Democrat of Texas. She announced Sunday that she's been diagnosed with pancreatic cancer and is undergoing treatment. She said it's likely she will be occasionally absent from Congress, but assured her district, which comes as part of Houston, that her office will continue to deliver vital constituent services that you deserve and expect. Those are your headlines for Tuesday, June 4th, 2024. I cannot do them without your support. Please sign up on Patreon to support me. Listen to the podcast as well if you're watching on YouTube or TikTok. Patreon.com/Pete Dominic. All right, now let's get to the sound bites, the audio clip section of the news segment here on Stand Up. Let's start with the hearing on Capitol Hill with Dr. Fauci I mentioned earlier, and I was pretty obsessed with this yesterday. I was watching the clips all day, so I grabbed several of them, maybe too much, maybe it's too overkill, but usually when I put together such a robust audio segment, people really like it. And of course, you can always skip ahead to the interview if you want. But let's start with the Republican chairman of the committee who asked Dr. Fauci, did the vaccines ever stop transmission of COVID? Fair question and a good question. And I thought this was a nuanced answer from the most famous scientist in the country.
The vaccine saved millions of lives, and I want to thank you for your support and engagement on that. However, despite statements to the contrary, it did not stop transmission of the virus. Did the COVID vaccine stop transmission of the virus?
That is a complicated issue because in the beginning, the first iteration of the vaccines did have an effect, not 100%, not a high effect, they did prevent infection and subsequently, obviously, transmission. However, it's important to point out something that we did not know early on that became evident as the months went by, is that the durability of protection against infection and hence transmission was relatively limited, whereas the duration of protection against severe disease, hospitalization, and deaths was more prolonged. We did not know that in the beginning. In the beginning, it was felt that, in fact, it did prevent infection and thus transmission. But that was proven as time went by to not be a durable effect.
All right. Interesting answer from Dr. Fauci. Now, the next Congresswoman, she thought she had him cornered. I'm surprised she didn't do more homework, or her staff didn't. This is Congresswoman Maliotakis, and she tried to corner Dr. Fauci on how much he made in royalties off of COVID. It doesn't go great for her.
Dr. Fauci, how much have you earned from royalties from pharmaceutical companies since the pandemic began in 2021?
Zero.
It says NIH scientists made $710 million in royalties from drug makers. You're saying that you did not receive any of the $710 million.
On COVID, I received, I think, $122 for a monoclonal antibody that I made 27 years ago.
Okay, so just in general, though, how much have you received, not related to COVID, just in general, how much have you received in royalties between 2021 and 2023?
I think none.
Okay, so somebody received the $710 million.
Somebody did, but not me.
You didn't receive any royalties. Okay.
I mean, I see no royalties associated with COVID. I mentioned.
I said.
No, I want to.
I just said.
I'm on the record, and I want to make sure that this is clear. That I've developed a monoclonal antibody about 25 years ago that's used as a diagnostic that has nothing to do with COVID, and I receive an average of about $120 a year from that patent.
Okay, but the bottom line
is you didn't do your homework. And you didn't get them there. Now, here is the worst of the worst. It's Marjorie Taylor Greene, and you probably heard this one already, but and you got to kind of see the pictures that she's holding up and the way that he's looking at it all. It's disgusting, but here it is.
Bleach blonde, bad built Bush body. Bleach blonde, bad built Bush body. Bush body, bad built Bush body.
Mr. Fauci, you were quoted on CBS Face the Nation saying it's easy to criticize, but they're really criticizing science because I represent science. Do you represent science, Mr. Fauci?
I am a scientist who uses the scientific method to gain information.
Yes, you said you represent science. Do you represent science, Mr. Fauci? Yes or no? Yes or no?
No, that's not a yes or no answer.
Yes, it's a yes or no.
I don't think it is.
Okay, well, we'll take that as you don't know what you represent. But this, as director of the NIH, you did sign off on these so-called scientific experiments. And as a dog lover, I want to tell you this is disgusting and evil, what you signed off on, and these experiments that happened to beagles paid for by the American taxpayer. And I want you to know Americans don't pay their taxes for animals to be tortured like this. So the type of science that you are representing, Mr. Fauci, is abhorrent, and it needs to stop. Mr. Fauci, you also represent the type of science where you confess that you made up the COVID rules, including 6 feet social distancing and masking of children.
I never said I made anything up.
You admitted that you made it up. You made it up as you went.
I made it up.
So are you saying this is fake news, Mr. Fauci?
I didn't say I made anything up.
What did you say?
I said that it is not based in science and it just appeared.
But this is science.
What does dogs have to do with anything that we're talking about today? These
are scientific experiments. This is what you signed off on. But you also told the American people they had to distance by 6 feet. They had to wear masks.
Bleach blonde, bad built Bush body.
There she goes.
Bad built.
Yeah.
bleach blonde.
Oh, it's so good. There's so many of them. I mean, Jasmine Crockett is such a big deal now as a result of that clapback. All right, now let's go to Debbie Dingle, who let Dr. Fauci talk a little bit about, or asked him to talk a little bit about the threats that he and his family received. This is tough to take and wildly unsurprising.
But I want to be perfectly clear, though, that the Select Subcommittee has seen no evidence of this. However, allegations by my Republican colleagues, amplified in the media, have led to real, tangible consequences for Dr. Fauci in his personal life in a way that should be unacceptable to all Americans. Dr. Fauci, you and I have known each other for a long time, and I'm not even going to admit how long. But during that time, I've seen your commitment not just to science, but to advancing the greater good. And I know that this isn't a topic you enjoy discussing, and I'm sorry I'm going to have to ask you about it. But I think the American people need to know what we are doing to those who are serving the common good and public health. I think it's important to make clear the harms that you and your loved ones have suffered because of these deeply irresponsible accusations. Because you know what? You're human, just like the rest of us. So, Dr. Fauci, can you please share with us the nature of the threats you have received since the start of the COVID-19 pandemic?
Yes, there have been everything from harassments by emails, texts, letters of myself, my wife, my 3 daughters. There have been credible death threats leading to the arrests of 2 individuals, and credible death threats mean someone who clearly was on their way to kill me. And it's required my having protective services essentially all the time. It is very troublesome to me. It is much more troublesome because they've involved my wife and my 3 daughters.
At these moments, how do you feel? Keep your mic on.
Terrible.
Do you continue to receive threats today?
Yes, I do. Every time someone gets up and says I'm responsible for the death of people throughout the world, the death threats go up.
Here's a short back and forth with Jim Jordan, which I thought was pretty good. It's about 20 seconds and went viral just because of the way that Dr. Fauci claps back a little bit.
Do you agree that there was a push to downplay the lab leak theory?
Not on my part.
Really?
Really?
Wow. I think most of the country would find that amazing. I still got 11 seconds.
But look at the facts. I've kept an open mind throughout the entire process.
All right, I yield back.
And Jamie Raskin had his back, had Dr. Fauci's back, as he always seems to in situations like this where the witness is being absolutely attacked by the Republican villains on the committee.
And
correct.
You were director of the National Institute of Allergies and Infectious Diseases for more than 3 decades. Is that right?
38 plus years.
38 years. Okay. And I assume that you've never been accused of trying to start a disease before. Is that right?
That is correct.
You have devoted your life to fighting infectious diseases for the American people. Is that right?
That is correct.
And Congressman Garcia, I thought, was very poignant and dramatic in his comments to Dr. Fauci. He's a Democrat, and he wanted to give a little background and remind us what the stakes were back at the height of COVID and how much he and so many others lost.
From California for 5 minutes of questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Fauci, I am so sorry you just had to sit through that. That was completely irresponsible. Quite frankly, we're hearing, this might be the most insane hearing I've actually attended. I've only been in Congress for a year and a half, but I am so sorry that you are subjected to those level of attacks and insanity. Your quote-unquote so-called science that the gentlewoman is referring to has saved millions of lives in this country and around the world, and I want to thank you for that. I also think it's important to note that, in my opinion, is that you are an American hero, and your team has done more to save lives than all 435 members of this body on both sides of the aisle. You guys have worked not just during this pandemic, but over time to save millions of lives in this country and across the world. We lost 1.1 million American lives. 1.1 million American lives, 7 million lives around the world. We were having 9/11-like events, death events daily in this country, losing 4,000, 5,000 people every single day. I was mayor during the time of the pandemic. I remember how painful it was to close businesses, to shut down schools, but how quickly we forget the pain and how scared we were as a country. We were washing our groceries as they were coming in. We were keeping seniors at a distance. The tragedy that was happening in our nursing homes. Thousands of people were dying a day, and you and your team of the best and the brightest scientists in this country and the world were doing everything that you could and working night and day to save more and more of those lives. A lot of my colleagues know that my mom was a healthcare worker during the pandemic. My mom died of COVID. My stepfather died of COVID. I lost both of my parents during the pandemic. So I take this very personally, especially when other members of this body who are tasked to be responsible and to actually help the American people attack medical professionals like you and across the world.
Congressman Garcia yesterday thought he did good, thought Jared Moskowitz was pretty good as well. He's always on point. He's got prepared remarks, but he's also ready to improvise, and I think that matters a lot.
Dr. Fauci, you talked about how, we live in partisan times, a lot of misinformation, and, colleagues on this body said, you should be charged and found guilty. Of course, the only one that's happened to is your former boss. But the question I have is, when you saw a lot of that disinformation, whether it was, we can use a disinfectant to do like a cleaning or do light in the body, or that, China's working super hard, President Xi's got it contained, all of the stuff that was being put out, were you concerned? What was your feeling at that time? Working in the administration, seeing that come from the podium?
Well, I was very frustrated by that. It was very clear. I was put in a very difficult position that I didn't like, of having to contradict publicly the President of the United States. I took no great pleasure in that, but I felt it was my responsibility to preserve.
He must have thought you did a great job. He gave you a commendation right before he left.
Well, I felt it was my responsibility, as to preserve my own personal integrity and my major responsibility to the American public to tell them the truth. And if I could just take this opportunity, when I was saying that if you attack me, you attack science, I didn't mean that I am science. What I meant was that when the data showed that hydroxychloroquine does not work, and there are people saying, oh, it does, I'll give it to people, and we know it can be hurtful to them, then when you're attacking what I'm saying, that the science shows it doesn't work, and the science shows that bleach doesn't work, that when you attack that, you really are attacking science, because science has shown that it doesn't work. That's what I meant. When you're attacking me, you're attacking science.
Thank you, Doctor. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Well, Congressman Debbie Lesko had a whole bunch of emails, apparently, or she was presenting them as emails. I don't know about this. This one I do have a lot of questions around. I want to learn more context here about these emails. A lot of people talking about them, including people like Glenn Greenwald. And while I think he's lost pretty much all credibility, I still read what he writes and his point of view on things and the whole emails and suppressing the lab leak theory. But, well, listen for yourself. Here's just a portion of it, but maybe we should all know a little bit more about the context. We'll talk about this at the Hangout as well. I'm interested in the lab leak theory. I'm not shooting it down. Here she is, Debbie Lesko, questioning Dr. Fauci, though.
My next question, sir, is on February 1st, 2020. Yourself, Dr. Fauci, the NIH Director Collins, and at least 11 other scientists were on a conference call to discuss the origins of COVID. A number of the scientists said that they were concerned that COVID was the result of a lab leak at the Wuhan Institute of Virology, and were concerned that a revelation of the lab leak theory would hurt their relationship with China. The CDC Director Redfield testified that he was not invited on this conference call, and he believes that because he believed the lab leak theory was possible. 3 days later, on February 4th, 2020, 4 participants on the conference call authored a paper, Proximal Origin, which was sent to you for editing. Proximal origin pushed the natural origin theory. On April 16, 2020, the NIH director, Dr. Collins, emailed you expressing dismay that the Nature Medicine article, which was based on proximal origin, didn't suppress the lab leak theory, and asked you for more public pressure to suppress the lab leak theory. The very next day, in response to Dr. Collins' request to suppress the lab leak theory, you cited the Nature Medicine article, which discounted the lab leak theory from the White House podium. My question to you, sir, did you cite this article at the White House because the NIH director asked you to suppress the lab leak theory?
I did not do that in response to anybody's suggestion to suppress anything. It was in response to a question that someone asked at the podium, and I did not edit any paper as shown in my official testimony. So you said about 4 or 5 things, Congressman, that were just not true.
Well, we have emails to prove it.
But you don't.
Thank you, and I yield back.
I now recognize Mr. Mfume from Maryland for 5 minutes of questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. And by the way, no, we don't have it. So I get tired of hearing we got it, and then when we ask for it, it's not there.
All right, well, where is it? Where are the emails, and what do I need to know? I'll talk to you more about that and everything else on Thursday at our weekly hangout. If you're not a subscriber, you are a subscriber, you're missing out. If you're not getting the daily email, someone told me yesterday he's not getting the daily email. If you're a Patreon subscriber, check your settings and make sure that you do. Send me your vitamin N pictures. I share that each and every day. And don't forget to watch the news segment on YouTube, TikTok, Facebook, Instagram, everywhere else. I'm posting it. I do want to mention, before I get to my guest, an email from a listener. Always love that, especially when it's some kind of criticism or complaint. I always like to hear from you. But Ryan G. said, I love your interviews with David Rothkopf, but I think he may be painting with too broad of a brush yesterday. Twice he blasted UFC viewers and fans as monolithic ogres who can't read books. Well, I joined the military in 1995. I've also been involved in martial arts in one form or another almost 3 decades. I've been listening to Stand Up since 2010. I voted both Republican and Democrat in my adult life. I voted for Joe Biden in 2020. I'm definitely not always on the right side of the argument. Hey, I was for the Iraq War before I was against it. I was against LGBTQ in the military before I was for it. Despite all my faults, I did actually learn to read. I actually have 3 books on my nightstand right now that I'm working through. Some recommend in your podcast. And if you haven't read Beyond by Stephen Walker, you should check it out, Pete. My eldest daughter has competed in judo since she was 10. We enjoy watching UFC together. And as a fellow father of a 19-year-old, I treasure any moment she will spend with me. So maybe David Rothkopf should throw his broad brush in the garbage. Ryan, I totally agree. And sometimes I don't push back on guests or don't say something even when I disagree because I want to keep the flow of the interview going. That happens sometimes, or I just don't know exactly what to say in the moment and think of it later. But I heard that. I watch UFC. I don't pay-per-view or anticipate the fights, but I watch it on YouTube. I watch the clips. Not a lot. But I'd be lying if I said I didn't watch it, like a lot of other people I know that obviously do read. I think he was being very hyperbolic, but I do appreciate the sensitivity on it, and I certainly appreciate you in that email. Send your emails, standupwithpete@gmail.com. All right, one more clip. How about it? Just some laughs, and then we'll get to my conversation with Jessica Calarco. This is Jimmy Kimmel on, I think, Friday night. I love this couple minutes. It made me happy, made me laugh at the total disaster that is America, Donald Trump, and everything he's done to us. And so I thought you'd appreciate that. And then we'll get to my great conversation and interview with Jessica Calarco.
We are still buzzing from the recreational cannabis and also from the verdict that was handed down so bigly and beautifully in New York City yesterday. Our one-time commander-in-chief scored the most guilty verdicts of any president ever. He went 34-0. Topping the 1971-72 Lakers, who won 33 in a row. And Trump did it without Will Chamberlain or Jerry Rest. He did it all by himself. It was a day that will be written about in history books. For those of you watching in Florida, history books are things you used to have at your schools before Ron DeSantis was governor. The verdict was unanimous on all charges. Each juror received a thank you from the judge and Hickory Farms gift basket, mysteriously signed Melania T. Melania was not in court when the verdict was read, but she released a strong statement today posting about how much she loves and supports her husband no matter what the outcome of the trial was. I'm kidding. She didn't say anything. She said nothing at all. She was nowhere to be found. She was probably online buying a new summer hat. I don't know. There's still 3 other cases against Trump, each one for more serious crimes. This is like the lowest hanging mushroom of the group. And it does feel a little bit unsatisfying given the scope of how many brazenly illegal things this man has done that they would start by getting him for this. This is like if OJ had been convicted for speeding. Like, do you know how fast you're going in that Bronco, sir? You know, it's funny how things work in the upside-down world we live in. Everything to them is a win. Every one of these Trumpers now wants to play this like it's a good thing, like it's great news that their candidate for president was convicted of 34 felonies. The tributes to MAGA Teresa were flowing from great lines like this gentleman who proclaimed today was our George Floyd moment. I don't know, is that good? And at what point... Put that back up. At what point into asking AI to generate an image of Donald Trump in cornrows do you say to yourself, I should probably get back to work? Here's another one from Trump's longtime advisor and fellow felon Roger Stone. The only thing Trump is guilty of is being the greatest president since Abraham Lincoln. Oh, and 34 felonies on top of that. But not every Trump fan was looking for a fight. Some, like this guy outside a court in New York, expressed hope that we can come together to get past this.
Not guilty. I hope this is the hope the country doesn't burn down. Not guilty. I hope that we can find a way to love each other and to make right this prostitution. Go yourself and your mother.
Well, that didn't last long, but in New York, it's an affectionate term.
All right. That was probably too much. It's still the stand-up podcast. I don't know if I ruined it all for you. All right, I've learned to love sociology. I had a course in college, actually a couple of courses in sociology in college, and I've always been interested in the subject, and I've loved interviewing sociologists. I think they're such an important thinkers in our country and in our system. And my guest today is a professor of sociology at the University of Wisconsin. She's an expert on families and schools and inequalities. She's a mother of 2. She's the author of Negotiating Opportunities and A Field Guide to Grad School, the co-author of Qualitative Literacy and contributor to the New York Times, the Atlantic, and the Washington Post. But it's her new book that we're talking about today. It's called Holding It Together: How Women Became America's Safety Net. Because American society, she says, is being held together by women. Unpaid or underpaid women bear the brunt of critical tasks, including caring for children, the elderly, and the vulnerable, and keeping institutions like schools, community groups, and religious organizations afloat. Their work, often done at the cost of their physical, emotional, and financial well-being, is what allows the United States to get by without the infrastructure that our peer nations take for granted. The patchwork DIY system is not only unfair, it's totally unsustainable. You can find her online and read more about her work there. All the links in the show notes. Ladies and gentlemen, Professor Jessica Calarco joins me for the first time right now. Oh my gosh, there she is. Very excited to talk to a brilliant sociologist and author about her very important new book, Holding It Together: How Women Became America's Safety Net. I've been reading it. It's so important. Congratulations on publishing this book and your whole career. I'm really flattered to get an opportunity to talk to you.
Oh, thank you so much for inviting me. It's a pleasure to chat with you today.
Do you like doing, by the way, these interviews about like a book about the subject? Do you enjoy doing it? Because I love like you.
Yeah, I mean, it's great to have a chance to share these ideas. I mean, I enjoy teaching my undergraduate students and my graduate students about these ideas, but having a chance to bring them to a wider audience is, both an honor and a joy.
Well, I've listened to some of your interviews. You're obviously really good at it, but I feel like it's sometimes hard to talk about a book that you put so much into. But you're a sociologist and you're a professor and you know how to communicate well. I think the best way, obviously, to talk about it is by going into some of the anecdotes that you tell. Just talk to me about how you did this book over several years, hundreds of actual interviews with real, actual human women who are you're covering.
Sure. So this book didn't start out as the book that it turned out to be. Instead, I originally envisioned this as a study of the best laid plans of parenting, how you have ideas about the kind of parent that you want to be, and then things go wrong. Life gets in the way. And how do you cope with that? And how do you shape your ideas about parenting in the process? And so I started working with a team of graduate and undergraduate research assistants, recruiting 250 pregnant women from prenatal clinics in Indiana. And we were in the process of, we asked those women all kinds of questions about the parenting decisions they planned to make for their new babies. And then we were following up with them every 6 months to see, what decisions are you actually making? How are things going? And the pandemic hit in the middle of this data collection.
Right.
Indeed. And so it became this moment of we have to, it was very clear from the onset how much of an impact the pandemic was having, particularly on, families and especially mothers of young children. And so we did some additional data collection, including 2 national surveys, each with about 2,000 parents from across the U.S. to see, how are these patterns that we're seeing in Indiana playing out across the whole country. And there was this moment, during the pandemic where it seemed like we might have a chance to build back better. And I thought that was where this book was going, that this might be the story of how we finally learned from a crisis, how we could stop, exploiting women and using their labor as the solution. But we didn't. And so then it became sort of even more imperative for me to tell this story and say, how did we get to this point where we are, instead of having a social safety net to relying on women to hold it together instead?
Yeah, it's fascinating to read the history of it. I mean, I had no idea. So let's start with the things that a lot of us might not have known. Maybe you didn't know about the war effort and the effort that the government had, the internal debate that they had to try to recruit women to the war effort. I feel like everybody knows a little bit about some of the propaganda and promotional campaigns, but you go into the guts of where that began and why it was necessary, which I thought was really interesting. Tell me what happened.
Thanks. Yeah, so essentially the War Manpower Commission figured out during World War II that they needed as many women as possible to be working for pay, given that we had so many men off fighting in battle. And that meant including women with young children, mothers of young children, most of whom at the time were married women. And during that era, many states and employers explicitly banned married women and women with young children from holding jobs, especially the kinds of jobs that were often held by men. And so that was one piece of the equation that they had to tackle, was getting rid of these marriage bans. But then they also had to deal with the childcare problem, because at the time, only about 1 in 30 moms of young kids were employed. And, they needed as many of them in the workforce as possible. And so what they figured out was that they could use, after some pressure from various people, that they could use money from the Lanham Act, which was essentially a defense spending bill, to build childcare centers in communities that were core to the defense production effort. And so these centers, they were high quality government run childcare centers that offered 10 or 12 hours a day, or sometimes even more, of high quality childcare, all for less than $10 per day in today's dollars. So it was highly affordable, high quality care for children.
This is fascinating. The ad campaign trying to get women to do these types of jobs. You write, targeting women, the ad campaign targeting women and touting their importance to the war effort, arguing that, quote, pressure should be applied to force their utilization. The commission agreed. Soon after, it was published a flyer that read, this is what they put out. I never heard of this. If Hitler came to Mobile, Alabama, every woman would defend her home with a gun, a knife, or bare fingers. But Hitler and his hordes will not come if women help to build ships, more ships to transport our men, tanks, planes, and munitions to the battle lines on other continents, or if women take other jobs directly aiding the war. That sounds pretty motivating, fear tactic. And it works today. It worked yesterday, and it could have worked then, but apparently it failed.
Yeah, and that's the thing. So this kind of propaganda, it was effective to some extent. They got to the point where almost 100% of women without young children were employed because of propaganda like that, because of messages telling women that this is your patriotic duty to join the war effort. But for women with young children, there simply weren't options. There weren't childcare options at the time, and they were taking care of young children at home and often had no choice but to stay home at the time. And so it really took those Lanham Act childcare centers to get moms of young kids into the workforce.
At the beginning of the book, you identify all of that and how there was really a missed opportunity. I feel like that's what you're saying, that at the end of World War II, there was a huge missed opportunity. And obviously Europe had to rebuild. And so everybody went to work rebuilding, but they did that effectively. And you write about how France redesigned their healthcare system after the war, but we didn't. And I feel like in the book, we jump right into kind of today. Is there a question I should be asking you before? Like, did nothing really significant change? Obviously, Medicare was passed, and we can talk about the 60s and the Civil Rights Movement and the Voting Rights Act, much of which has now been gutted. But where do we go from World War II up until today in terms of efforts and helping women? I mean, you can ask many questions, but I'll say have daycare so they could actually go to work.
Yeah, and certainly I think World War II was this turning point moment where many of our European allies invested in building strong social safety nets. They used taxes and regulations to keep people from falling into poverty, to give people a leg up with economic opportunities, to address gender inequities and racial inequities, and ensure that people have, time and energy to contribute to care work, through things like, paid maternity or paid paternity leave. Whereas in the U.S., and this sort of built on ideas that were already being introduced prior to World War II, particularly in the wake of the New Deal. I talk in the book about the National Association of Manufacturers and their efforts to kind of promote neoliberalism as a set of ideas in the U.S. to undermine people's belief in the need for a social safety net in the wake of, New Deal policies that would have required higher taxes. And so they were sort of already laying the groundwork for these changes before World War II and pushing us in the direction of what I call a DIY society, essentially forcing people to manage risk on their own as opposed to relying on a government safety net to be able to provide that protection instead.
Talk a little bit about what France did or any other European country did or does now. I mean, you could pick Asian countries, you could pick Israel, you could pick Australia, I suppose, if you wanted to. But just specifically in terms of how that worked out for them in Europe, most of your book is obviously looking at America, but in terms of the disparities that they now have in, say, France versus we have in terms of men and women working and much less couples.
Yeah, so certainly, France is a great example in terms of, having access to universal childcare, universal affordable childcare for all families with young children, universal paid leave, limits on paid work hours, kind of strict limits on how many hours people can work for pay in a given week. All of these things together operate not only to reduce gender inequalities. So compare, if you look at men's and women's engagement in paid work and men's and women's engagement in unpaid labor, like housework, those gaps are smaller in France. And it's not because French men are doing more than American men. It's actually because everyone is doing less, in the sense that people in France have more time for leisure, more time for sleep, more time to, spend time with loved ones, because they are protected in these ways through policies that, limit the demands that paid work can make on them and provide them some security in the process too.
Can we just do one thing that you didn't cover in your book, but it might be a good way to promote your book? And let me just say this, sadly, because this is the last thing that you would want to talk about, but I can't imagine a more controversial thing being said and getting more attention that directly relates to your book than what the Kansas City Chiefs kicker said at this commencement speech the other day. I don't know if you've weighed in on that anywhere, but it would seem that, let me just put it this way. He talked a lot about, I'll be generous, he talked a lot about what women's ambitions should be and what women want, which is one of my favorite things to do, is to listen to football players talk about what women want. Nonetheless, that's what he did. 2 women graduating, if the context even matters. What do you say in the book, and how do you respond to a speech like that, where a man in this case, or a woman, is talking about what women should want and do want, and what their role in society should be? I'm leaving it wide open for you.
Yeah, so I talk in the book about this idea of the myth of Mars and Venus. And I think what Harrison Butker said was very much part of this myth. And one key portion of that is this idea that women are just happier at home, that they're just better off, and that, it's better for kids, it's better for women, it's better for families if they are in the home. And what I would argue is that kind of mythology, it allows men to feel like good guys, or at least not to feel like bad guys, even if they are exploiting the labor of women in their lives and their families and in society. And it's almost not surprising. And we've actually seen an uptick in those kinds of sexist attitudes among young men. Surveys have shown that this is actually becoming more common among Gen Z and millennial men to buy into these ideologies than it is among their sort of older counterparts, which makes me nervous, but I think it reflects the fact that we've put so much onto women and we've used women as this sort of glue to hold our society together. And these ideas become a way of justifying that, of not feeling bad about the kinds of harm that come along with that. When we have, a childcare crisis that forces many couples to choose between being cash negative or having one parent stay home, then, it makes sense to find ways of rationalizing or justifying, oh, she's just going to be happier here. If they literally can't afford to have both parents work for pay, and if she makes less than he does because of gender pay gaps, then these ideologies become appealing in ways that make them hard to combat.
Very well said. Yeah. And I also just wonder, just one more, you just made me think of something else. We are seeing changes in certainly the data. You're the scholar, but anecdotally in men and young men's behavior. And I kind of want to just say that during my generation, I'm 48, I feel like I personally, and my generation of men, we've become, for lack of a more thoughtful way of saying it, more feminine, more sensitive, more introspective, more open to going to therapy, more open to talking about our feelings, more interested in gender equity and women's reproductive rights and stepping aside and listening. That's been the trend. And I'm seeing this generation and people my age being affected by exactly what you just said. Could you just say a little bit more about what you're seeing? Because also in that speech, he made a comment to the men, of course, too. You've seen people like Senator Josh Hawley and everybody in right-wing media, including Joe Rogan and others, talk about men need to be more masculine and tougher and all of that. I just want to get one more take on that, and then we're going to get right into your research in the book and the people you talk to.
No, sure. So there was, so Ipsos, which is a survey company, does a survey every year on the International Women's Day that looks at, attitudes around gender roles. And this is where some of this data is coming from, showing that young men, particularly, Gen Z and then kind of younger millennial men, it's not universal. It's not across the board, but there has been an uptick in men saying that we've essentially gone too far, that men have become too soft, or that we've gone too far in promoting gender equity, that it's now hurting men, and buying into exactly the kind of rhetoric that you were just talking about. And I think it stems from the fact that rhetoric is, it's not only being promoted by people in positions of power and authority, but it's also sticky because of this world that we live in that makes it seem as though, it makes it appealing for men when there is so much economic precarity to feel like, okay, if I just focus on, getting the best paid job that I can, if I can afford to have a wife who stays home and can take care of these things. Unfortunately, research also tells us that one of the best ways for men to get ahead in their own careers is to have a stay-at-home wife. And so there's an economic incentive to that too, which again kind of makes this message appealing, especially in the context of so much economic uncertainty, given the kind of DIY model that we're promoting as a society.
Oh, are we promoting that, man? It is just say examples of that. I feel like you're talking about and writing about obviously owning your own small business. But I see so many women, I confess, I click on attractive women on Instagram or TikTok. And so it just feeds me more because I'm a monster. And so many of these women are doing side hustles. Not even talking about like OnlyFans or something like that. Obviously, I'm talking about like just women, that are like selling clothes and other products on TikTok to make a little cash on the side, much less obviously the more traditional entrepreneurial businesses that you can do online. But it's all about the hustle and the DIY. That's what you're talking about, those types of
yeah. I think that's a big part of it. And part of it is also just managing risk. So essentially in the US, we treat women as we tell people that you can, get by on your own without support, whether that's by starting your own business or just by working hard, even in the traditional economy. Yeah. But the reality is that we really can't manage all of that risk on our own. That's the point of a strong social safety net. And that without that net to maintain this illusion that hard work alone, can promote success in our society, we end up relying on women to kind of fill in the gaps as default caregivers for the children, the elderly, the sick, and also the ones who hold the lowest paid jobs in our economy. So 70% of the lowest wage jobs are held by women, and they're also disproportionately in jobs that are underpaid relative to other types of work. Oftentimes not just because they're feminized jobs, but because they're too labor intensive to be profitable in a highly capitalistic market-driven economy. So things like childcare, where almost all of the labor that goes into it is physical human labor, and there's very little profit that can be made. That kind of work very often gets pushed onto women. 97% of childcare workers, for example, are women, because it's work that can't be made profitable, and so it doesn't really work in our kind of economic system.
Part one of your book is how we get women to hold it together. it's so important to talk about the first section about how we make women mothers. We force them to be mothers in waiting. You talk about leaving women with no choice and leaving others morally trapped. But just touch a little bit on this first part of the book, because I think it's important and frankly provocative.
Sure. I mean, I think it gets at this idea. There's lots of routes into exploitation, but the motherhood trap is what I argue one of the key routes or key mechanisms that the U.S. uses to force women into doing a disproportionate share of both the unpaid and underpaid labor. And essentially, it has to do with the fact that once we make women or anyone responsible for children and then leave them with nowhere to turn for support in managing that responsibility and nowhere to hide when people come asking them to manage even more help, it becomes, tremendously difficult to resist the kind of exploitation that's involved in our system. And actually, this is how our welfare rules are written. In the U.S., we require that to receive welfare payments, even though they're deeply meager. Moms that I talked to in Indiana, for example, a single mom of two can get a maximum of $288 a month in welfare payments. And yet, to get that money, it's shameful how little it is, but she still has to work for pay in order to earn that money. And oftentimes that means taking the first job that's available to her. And that's often how women, especially mothers of young children, often single moms of young children, get pushed into holding these kinds of low-wage jobs in retail or in childcare or in home health care, because those are the only jobs available to them, given the kinds of caregiving burdens that they face.
You do such a good job explaining real life through actual women who you interviewed stories about how difficult it is for someone to ever get ahead, and how more specifically it is for women, obviously, when it comes to being moms or not. But the bottom line, and I've learned this through my work with a bunch of anti-poverty groups, is I was astonished by it as I learned it. Well, if you get this benefit, you have to do this. And if you do that, you're going to lose that benefit. And if you get these two benefits, you're going to get less of this one. And we're talking about daycare. We're talking about housing. We're talking about healthcare, economic opportunity of different sorts, jobs opportunity. But specifically, we're talking about food. I feel like a lot of times it's just food. So tell me, I guess you can illustrate that with several different women you talked to, but I was really interested in the story about Akari, who is this young woman. She's doing pretty good. She's first generation, I think, Japanese. Her family's mostly back in Japan. Her mom moved back. She married a guy, and he was killed. Somehow he was killed in a violent incident. They don't know exactly what happened, but now here she is alone with her kids, little kids, right? And where can she turn? A little to his family, but when it comes to turning to government and help, it's a goddamn nightmare, it sounds like.
Yeah, I mean, she was before the pandemic. She was a stay-at-home mom of two young kids, and that was before. And that was essentially, it wasn't that she chose to be a stay-at-home mom, but she couldn't. He had a small business, and she was working a job in retail, and they couldn't afford to pay for childcare, given how much that costs in the U.S. And so she left her job to stay home with the kids, and things were fairly stable financially, until her partner was killed during kind of in the summer of 2020. And unfortunately, it was, he didn't have life insurance like most Americans, and they didn't have much in savings because they were trying to build this business. And so that left her, deeply in a deeply precarious position economically. She ends up she actually moves herself and her children into a women's shelter, because that was the best way to get off of the wait list for affordable housing. They couldn't afford to stay in their apartment. And then, she signs up for welfare, signs up for food stamps. But even that is often, not enough to make ends meet. And she's also required to find paid work on top of that. So she starts with one part-time job and then adds a second and then adds a third that finally gets her to the point where she feels like she's, a little bit more economically stable. Though that means spending the weekends away from her kids to work this third job in another town. But it pushes her over the benefits cliff. And so with these, these incomes from these three jobs, now she's lost access to all of the subsidized services, things like affordable housing, things like, affordable childcare. And she told me, she's like, I would be better off going back on welfare, quitting these jobs and going back. But there's also time limits on welfare, which mean that you can't do that in the long term. And so she's just kind of stuck in the sense that she has to keep working, has to keep trying to get ahead, but barely gets to see have any time with her kids, and talked about how essentially this has been, devastating for her and for her whole family in terms of the costs that it's had for them.
Oh, you're so good at talking about your book. That's exactly what you wrote, basically. And that's the most important point, or the most heartbreaking point, when you write that she now took a job on the weekends as well. And her son went from having both parents loving Then he loses his dad. His dad dies, and then his mom is gone every weekend. And any parent knows that even if you don't have money, if you have time, just time is what makes you wealthy. Time with your kids is what helps them more than anything. Even if I've always said, if you're not a good parent, many of us have a lot of flaws, but if you were there, the kid knows that you were there. And when you're not there, it's so much different. And the shock on this poor child to have it and then to lose it. But a lot of kids don't even ever probably have it. You can talk about them as well. Talk to me about Brooke, who never wanted to be a mother, going back to how we force women to become mothers.
Yeah, I mean, this gets at the idea that even before Dobbs, we had cultural norms in place that could push women into motherhood, even if they didn't want to be there. And that was very much the case for Brooke, who, growing up, she had a very difficult home life with her parents and didn't want to be a parent because she didn't want to bring kids into the world, given the kinds of challenges that she had faced herself. But she, like many people, ended up accidentally becoming pregnant in college. And she actually initially planned to get an abortion. Her boyfriend's parents even offered to pay for the abortion. But her own mom found out and persuaded her to keep the baby, persuaded her that they would help her, finish college and also raise the child. And what happened, though, was that once the baby was born, they figured out that they really, couldn't afford both childcare and college. And Brooke didn't trust her parents to care for her son because because of what she'd experienced growing up. And so night classes weren't really an option. And that meant she ended up dropping out of college and signing up for welfare and taking the first job that she could find, which initially was in retail, which was a job that she really didn't like. It was a job, she actually was working with her mom in a retail store, and it was not a good environment. And she ends up, the next job that she finds is actually working for her son's childcare center. And so she goes from, not wanting to be a mom to being a childcare worker in the span of, just a little over a year. And that essentially, and at the same time, this was, a job that she loved, but it wasn't financially rewarding. It was, even when she got promoted to assistant director of the center, she was still only making about $25,000 a year. And so it's just this kind of cycle of how we take women and kind of push them into motherhood, or oftentimes either now legally force them into motherhood or guilt and gaslight them into motherhood, even if that's not where they're sure they want to be. And then that becomes a route into exploitation.
Just let me step outside the book for a second. And a lot of the women you interviewed were in Indiana, and you talked broadly about policy and law. How different is it for women in different states? The federal government applies, I was almost going to say everywhere, laws and so on equally, but of course it doesn't. I mean, the Medicaid expansion, which would give health care, I think it's like 20 million people in Texas, never got to them. It got to the rest of us, Medicaid expansion, including my family, like Obamacare, subsidies. It's amazing. But so many people did not get that federal benefit paid for by the federal government because some states in our country hate people, and cruelty is the point, and punishing them. And we can smash myths in a moment. But what's the difference for women in one state versus another state, if you want to pick anything?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. There's huge differences. I mean, we can even look at things like the minimum wage, which in Indiana and in many other states is still $7.25 an hour. It's still the federal minimum, even as other states have bumped it up to $15 an hour. And that disproportionately impacts women. I think I mentioned before that women hold 70% of the lowest wage jobs in our economy. And so what that means is that in any state, they're often the ones holding the minimum wage jobs. And so those differences, that means the situation for women is literally double in terms of income in some states than it is relative to others. And oftentimes the states that have these limited policies that offer, that didn't take the Medicaid expansion, that haven't raised the minimum wage, that don't offer generous welfare benefits, that, have more punitive work requirements, those things tend to go together in ways that exacerbate inequalities between women across states, that those who are in, the most punitive or restrictive states are sort of doubly or triply or quadruply disadvantaged compared to those elsewhere.
Well, Jessica, sounds easy enough. If you are a woman and you are struggling, why wouldn't you just move to one of those states where you can have a lot more opportunity?
Yeah, I mean, one of the challenges there is that, our social networks matter, and in part because we don't have access to this sturdy social safety net, that having family nearby is oftentimes, especially for families with young kids, one of the best ways to manage within the absence of affordable childcare. And so, and even times with elder care responsibilities, women are often part of the sandwich generation, where they are tasked not only with caring for young children, but also caring for elderly parents or relatives who are dealing with illness, or even relatives whose kids have been struggling because of the opioid crisis. I talk about cases like that in the book as well. And so there's, obligations that we have to other people that make it hard for us to simply move to the places where the opportunities are better over time.
I had the rare opportunity to talk to a young man the other day. I was picking up my daughter at college, and he said something like, yeah, because we all have the same opportunities, right? I was joking about, he was telling me just to park in the handicapped spot while we load up. And I go, I don't think I'll do that. I don't think I'd ever do that. and I use it. And he said something about, oh, come on, everybody's got the same opportunity or something like that. And I was just astonished kind of to hear that from a young person. But a lot of people think that. You do such a good job at crushing myths in this book and a whole section. And I think for that alone, it's so important. And so my question is, the welfare queen myth has probably done more damage to Americans thinking around this issue of opportunity that I'm trying to muddle through here than anything else. Tell us the truth about opportunity and choices.
Yeah, so certainly, we tell people in the U.S., we have this idea of kind of that we live in a meritocracy, that, to that young man's point, we all have the same opportunities, that if all of us just, work hard, if we just have the right mindset, we'll be able to be successful. And surveys show, Pew Research Center surveys have tracked this over time and show that the majority of Americans do believe that if people just work hard enough, they'll be able to be successful, without government support. And so the problem there is that that's, not the reality, that oftentimes, yes, certainly hard work matters, but it's not a guarantee. And that those who have succeeded in our society have often gotten there, not necessarily just because of their hard work, but often because of the privileges that they've had to get them there in the process too. And so at the same time, these myths are sticky. This perception that we can just get ahead by working hard, especially in a society as unequal as ours is deeply attractive, because it means that, no matter where you started, you have a chance to be hopeful for a better future. And so it's appealing in that sense. And it's also appealing because it gives us a sense of moral superiority. It allows us to feel better about ourselves by saying, well, at least I'm better off than this guy, which means I must have worked harder. I must be a better person. And that's what I often heard, even from, mothers that I talked to who would have benefited from expanding the social safety net. They often opposed those kinds of policies.
Right.
Yeah, because it allowed them to sort of say like, oh, well, I'm better than those moms who need that support. In those kinds of ways.
I do that. I don't mean to do that, but I know I do it. And I also do something even worse. I'll see someone who I think, and totally, and I think, I guess it's racist way. I'll look at somebody when I'm really feeling down about myself or something, like a woman or even a person of color, and be like, that person looks like they're doing way better than me. I must really not be, talented or working hard. And I only say that openly because to give people permission to explore the psychological mindfuck as to why I would ever want to feel better or worse than somebody else or envious of somebody else. And why do we, I know you're not a psychologist, but how do you explain that? And how do we stop our brains from looking down on other people, which may be the most pernicious cultural issue, not only in America, but in India and across the world for the history of human civilization, I would imagine.
Yeah, what the research tells us on that front is that actually the best way to reduce that kind of thinking is by reducing inequality. That in places where society is more equal, people don't look down on each other in those same ways, or that there's less incentive to buy into these kinds of social comparisons or myths of meritocracy, because there's less to be gained by trying to one up the person next to you, and more to just be gained by sort of focusing on how we can all benefit from, broader social programs. And so unfortunately, like the inequality is deeply part of the problem, because it pushes us to say, how can I get a little bit of a leg up, or how can I feel a little bit better about myself, rather than saying, how could we all come together to fight for something better across the differences? And at the same time, those kinds of we've also been actively encouraged to think about those kinds of divisions. These myths, go back generations in terms of the way that even, I was talking about like the 1930s and the National Association of Manufacturers, that the propaganda campaigns promoting these myths, promoting this kind of up by your bootstraps mentality. General Electric Theater was this massively popular television program hosted by Ronald Reagan, maybe not surprisingly, that was designed to promote this kind of thinking, that was designed. And certainly we've seen this echoed in lots of racist messaging, lots of sexist messaging, lots of classist messaging over the years that encourages us to think these ways.
Yeah, I think you referred to Reagan at one point as the former union member who became an anti-union president or something like that. And I never thought of it that way. But of course, yeah, he was a union actor and that's how he made his living and he had the union protections. And then he did more damage to public and private sector unions than any individual, the Reagan revolution and movement, of course. The super mom myth is interesting. This applies across gender, I think. But I want to obviously to speak to it about women. But just going back to what you just said too, like I often pose this question to myself and others: when will I be happy? I'll be happy when I have this thing, when I achieve this achievement, when I overcome this issue, when my leg feels better, when my marriage is better, when my job, when my kids. That's when I'll be happy, just like all the rest of the people who I see who are doing so well. That's a myth that I've fallen into over and over, and that I know so many of the men I know. It's different for women, but it is the same kind of message being told to women in a different way about what you're supposed to be and what you can be. Talk to me. What is the supermom myth? And please crush it.
Yeah, so this gets at this idea that women are the natural best protectors for children, and it's often coupled with messages of threats to children. This perception that kids are under threat and that women, especially their own mothers, are the only ones who can step in to protect kids from those kinds of threats, which is how we get women, to be willing to sacrifice themselves, to buy into this ideology that we don't need a stronger social safety net, even if they would very much benefit from it themselves, to not kind of push back against this kind of sexist mythology, because it gives them a sense of, it makes them feel like superheroes, makes them feel like they can save the day, and that's, this takes a number of different forms. I talk about in the book how things like the anti-CRT panic or the, anti-trans kids panic is very much rooted in this kind of supermom mythology where mothers, especially kind of religiously or socially conservative mothers, are told that your kids are under threat from public schools or from libraries even, and that they're the only ones. But what this does is operate to push women to feel like they have to stay home full time with their children, or they have to, be careful about how much time they spend on paid work. And so it's ultimately operating to reinforce these inequalities by getting into women's heads.
I had planned to talk to you if there was time off air about it, but listeners know. And on Tuesday, we lost our Board of Education campaign election to that ideology, and many of which women, and over trans bathroom issue, which was completely made up. It wasn't a thing. They said that the board made a law that they didn't. New York made a law. The board had nothing to do with it. They said they did. They replaced the board members. But during the campaign and after the campaign, the messaging from many women was, we protected our kids from you, from the rest of us in town. And it won. It was a winning message, and we got crushed in my town. And it's been really catastrophic for those of us who worked on the campaign to be referred to, by the way. I'm making it personally, and it shouldn't be about me because I'm doing good, but like being called a pedophile over and over for advocating for, kids or LGBT kids is brutal, and it worked, and it scared the hell out of these parents. I will say they truly believed their kids were going to, somehow be, they said it over and over. They're going to have to see a penis in the bathroom, Jessica, over and over at board meetings. Even young kids said that.
And I think it gets at kind of how pervasive this kind of, fear-based messaging is, and also how effective it is in getting us to, buy into this idea that we should be, that we are the only ones who are capable of protecting our children, and that we have to kind of put up walls, as opposed to thinking about, actually we could do more as a society to keep children safe from harm, and that's, collective responsibilities that we could take on those fronts, that it doesn't have to be, and that public institutions are often very well equipped to make sure that, or often best equipped to make sure that we have not only, opportunities for some kids, but equitable opportunities for all, regardless of gender, regardless of race, regardless of class. And so I think this is where, we have to worry about what this is really doing to public education as a whole, or to public institutions as a whole, and how this is, kind of further promoting this kind of DIY model, that the more bifurcated we are, the more we're pushing families to have more individualized control, that it has big risks for society as a whole.
Oh, yeah. I'm witnessing them in my town right now. I have a lot more questions about the problems, and we barely scratched the surface on the book, but I do want to pivot here just for a minute to, solutions, which you obviously offer and think about. But hey, you're a sociologist, you're a writer, you're a professor, and certainly I would think that you've done a pretty good job at identifying the problems through these hundreds of interviews and surveys and data that you have. And I'm sure you're probably right. I think often, people are pretty accurate at looking at what the problem is. But sometimes the solutions, especially if they're policy solutions or new laws, look like they're going to solve the issue. And then counterintuitively, they don't. And we can look at a whole bunch of policies that have been left behind over the years in America at the state, federal, local level, and other countries. How do you know that the solutions that you believe are actually going to be effective? And name anything that you want.
Yeah, I mean, I think we know both from the example that other countries set for us with the kind of social safety nets that they've put in place and the way that those safety nets have not only reduced inequality, but also kind of encouraged more egalitarian attitudes around things like gender and race and class. We can also look at how, even in our own country, like with the universal childcare programs that we put in place during World War II, or even like with things like Social Security or Medicare, that we can do these big social programs and we can do them effectively. Certainly, Social Security is underfunded. And I think we can think about how do we make sure that these programs, when we do put them in place, are funded sustainably. I've seen some recent op-eds advocating for we just need to have more babies to solve the Social Security crisis. But that's not really the solution. And again, that's sort of putting it onto women, when in reality, we could solve that crisis by raising the income caps on Social Security to make that program sustainable, or increasing taxes on, wealthy people and corporations. There's lots of ways to make these kinds of programs sustainable in the long term. And they can also be coupled with other types of policy solutions that help to make sure that, even if we can't outsource everything, even if we can't outsource all of the healthcare, all of the childcare, we can have more time and energy in our own lives to be able to, contribute to a shared project of care through things like universal paid leave, universal vacation time, universal, sick leave, and also limits on things like paid work hours, like we talked about in France, as a way to sort of make sure that our paid work is not allowed to encroach too much on our lives, and that we have time to more equitably contribute on lots of fronts at home.
I always feel like the problem is that when we do have effective policies, the messaging, they're so good at it. I mean, Paul Ryan used to be, I guess you're probably familiar with him there in Wisconsin, right? He was so good at saying policies that were extremely effective had failed. Something like the war on poverty has failed. We've been fighting for 30 years and we still have poor people. The child tax credit that we saw, decrease child poverty like in half, it ended. And people say, see, it didn't work. How do you prove a negative? How do you message politically that, of course, the war on poverty has worked? Of course, Social Security and Medicare have been wildly effective. You don't remember what it was like without them. And if you cut them today, there would be so much worse. But it's so hard to win that, Jess. I called you Jess. I call all Jessicas Jess.
No, that's okay. No, that's fine. Yes. And I think you're right. And this is part of the problem. And this is where I think we have to attack the myths, that we can't just fight for the policies. We also have to attack the underlying myths that delude people into believing that we don't need these social safety net programs, and that also divide us by race and class and gender in ways that, persuade us to fight against each other and to compare ourselves to each other, instead of saying, how could we all benefit from these kinds of better programs? Because really so much of it is wrapped in, you were saying, welfare queen rhetoric or stereotypes that discourage us from wanting to associate with people who benefit from safety net programs. And if we could reduce that stigma, if we can reject some of those assumptions about people who need government support, it would be much easier for all of us to, I think, buy into and recognize the benefits that we could all get from having stronger universal programs, even if we have to pay a little bit more in taxes to get them.
And the best way to reduce that stigma is to talk to those folks, have them in your life. You interviewed them, so many of those, and you humanize them so well in your book. I mean, people aren't going to go talk to those folks. That's why you have to get this book, so you can understand exactly what American women are going through. It's so good. Congratulations. I'm really, really happy to have talked about it. Everybody should go buy it right now and support Jessica's work. And I hope that you get to promote it everywhere, and I'll do everything I can to spread the word. But thank you so much for talking to me today.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure chatting with you. Thank you.
All right, there you go. You made it to the end of today's podcast. Congratulations. You have won, more knowledge, more insight, hopefully, about everything that's happening today in the world and overall when it comes to women holding it all together. I really enjoyed her. She's great to communicate. She's just a really good talker. I definitely want to have her back on a broad range of issues. Hopefully she'll join me again. But please reach out to her and let her know that you heard her here on the show. To contact her, go to the show notes like they are for each and every guest. You are the best. You are so appreciated. If you're still listening, you're a bumblebee. It means you listen all the way to the end. I haven't heard from you bumblebees. If you didn't know you were one, but you listened all the way to the end, all of you, I'd love some emails. I'm feeling a little bit lonely and disconnected from the audience itself. It gets that way when you're alone in a studio talking into a microphone. So if anybody wants to email me because you're still listening and you like the show, I'd like to hear from you. standupwithpete@gmail.com. Send anything you want. Send your vitamin N photos, of course, some of them coming in yesterday, and your thoughts on anything, how you're doing in your life. I'd love to catch up, and I'll reply to as many of them as I can tomorrow and over the next couple of days. All right, looking forward to hearing from you and seeing you on Thursday night at our Hangout anytime on the Discord platform. John Carroll's a 2-time Emmy Award winner. Did you know that? Go to johncarroll.org and buy this song and support John. See him live. That's all I've got for you. I will talk to you tomorrow.
Start making sense and you stand up. No need to point your rifle to defend your town. Just stand up. You know they can't deny you what you're laying down. Boy, you better stand up. Show your face of every color, yellow, black, red, and brown. She's the place where every lost child will finally be found. There's only one thing to do before we stand our ground, and that's stand up. Stand up. Well, the founding fathers saw a land for all. They had to stand up. They had to stand up. They had a keen imagination for a crystal ball, drawing all the plans of stand up. But all they had to go on was the time they were in, with other causes for laws, and since they weren't even sin, they knew that change was gonna come before the change would begin. They had to stand up. All right, they had to stand up. We got to stand up. We got to look the devil square in the eye. We gotta let him know it is the time to go and make it clear when all we hear is a lie. Why you lying awake wondering where the money all went? It'll be the cost of freedom that'll go unspent. You can see him flee the scene of that experiment if you stand up. Alright, we got to speak up, we got to reach up and raise your voice in every way you know how. Don't be toes up, you got to show up. Ain't no better time to do it but now. No need to pledge allegiance to no wanton tribe. Rise up and show obedience to the voice inside. And listen well and it'll tell you not to run and hide. It says stand.